Well, good afternoon, everyone. On this beautiful day, thank you. My name is Deirdre Anderson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Hingham Historical Society. I'd love to welcome you all to our final lecture in this past year's series, Out of the Box, Stories from Our Collection. We will not meet in this space until fall, so I want to be sure you are all aware of the many programs at the Hingham Historical Society this spring. We left a convenient flyer for you on your chair. I also want to note that our Old Ordinary property will open for the summer on June 23rd for docent-led tours. So it's a fun place to be in historic Hingham this spring and summer, so we hope you will join us. I also want to invite all of you in celebration of today's speaker and what he will cover to what I hope is the first of many Hingham Historical Society field trips. That's right, we're going to rent a bus. And so we would love for you to join us on a field trip to the Peabody Essex Museum to see their exciting new exhibition On This Ground, Being and Belonging in America, which is ongoing. We would, however, if you are interested, like to get a gauge that PEM, as it is affectionately called, is open Thursdays through Sundays. So we want to get a gauge of what is the most convenient day for people before we lock in on a date. But we think that will be a lot of fun. There will be time for socialization and to see what our esteemed big sister museum on the North Shore is doing. So please, there's a sign-up sheet in the back of the room. Before I turn over the mic to today's to Education Chair Eileen McIntyre, I want to mark this historic moment. Last summer, when I first made email contact with today's esteemed speaker, I knew we were promoting a hybrid lecture, the way we call both this in-person audience and our Zoom audience at home. But frankly, I had no idea how we were going to pull that off. And so today, I want to publicly acknowledge Colin McGinnis, who is by day a member of the East Elementary School and Hingham's staff. And on the weekends of the Out of the Box series, the person who makes the magic of us zooming into households of our members all over the country. So Colin, I just want to thank you very, very much. And we have a small token of our appreciation. And we made his job more difficult, even to today, where last night, this was the Old Colony Montessori School casino. Literally a casino night happened in this space last night. So virtually every Cat 5 cable, every plug was undone this morning. So thank you, Colin. And we couldn't have done this year's series without the leadership of our education committee. So I also want to publicly acknowledge those members that are here with us today. Education Committee Chair Eileen McIntyre, Ruth Gilbert Whitner, and Lara Thompson. And I just have a small token of our incredible appreciation for this series, which was absolutely fantastic. So to Eileen, Ruth, and Lara, and then Kathy Curley, Jane Shute, and Ann McCarthy Egan, who couldn't join us today, our sincere thanks. So that's it for me. To our at-home audience, thanks so much. Here's Eileen McIntyre.
Thank you, Deirdre, the gracious, wonderful hostess, as always, never forgetting a detail. So it is with great pleasure and an honor for me to introduce George Schwartz, Associate Curator of Peabody Essex Museum in Salem. During his more than 2 decades at PEM, George has contributed to many of the institution's successful exhibitions, and you can read all about them in his bio on the PEM website, which I encourage you to visit. But his particular interests are maritime art, material culture, and early collecting, as well as museum history. George earned his BA in anthropology from Brown University, his master's in historical archaeology from UMass Boston, and his PhD in American Studies from Boston University. His book, Collecting the Globe, the Salem East India Marine Society Museum, published by the University of Massachusetts Press in 2020, explores the origins of the Peabody Essex Museum and illustrates how global objects have been used to shape an emerging national identity in the early United States. Schwartz has lectured internationally, has written articles and essays for museum catalogs, journals, and magazines. He also teaches material culture at Tufts University in their museum studies program. Thank you, George, for traveling from the North Shore to join us today and for bringing your dad with you as well. Welcome to the Hingham Heritage Museum. George Schwartz.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. I really appreciate the invitation and to be a part of this wonderful series. But I have to say that the title of the program that you see here, I hope I didn't give the wrong impression for those of you who are expecting to hear about Chuck Yeager and John Glenn, or possibly for Dorchester's own New Kids on the Block. You're going to be disappointed, but we could probably do a very fascinating material culture study of just what they're wearing. Instead, I'm going to be talking about objects like these. These are two of the earliest objects in the Peabody Essex Museum's collection, and more on them a little later. But during my years at the museum, I've worked with some of the earliest objects to enter the collection. And I found that these objects that were collected in the 19th century are powerful tools to understand the past, the present, and the future of this nation. So my book, which was mentioned before, connects what I call an object-based epistemology to the understanding of early American museums and identity. And at Tufts University, I teach emerging professionals at the Museum Studies program how to engage with material culture from diverse perspectives and to think critically and creatively about using objects both in museum and outside the museum. So, well, won't get to that quite yet. I want to sort of tie a bow on this wonderful lecture series and offer my experiences in these two worlds to demonstrate that the right stuff is often the material that has been in your collection and many collections for many, many years. And by looking anew at some of these collections, it can inform how institutions view objects in different points in time and help shape how we collect today and going forward. At the start, I find this quote by art historian and material culture theorist Jules Prown very thought-provoking, that objects created in the past are the only historical occurrences that continue to exist in the present. I think it's very powerful. You could think about so many possibilities with that statement. The hands that made that object. It's connoting something about who that person was, the time period they lived in, and that still exists here. And that, I mean, the historic record is very important, but the objects can tell us even so much more, especially for those who might not be part of the historical record. And I would also maybe sort of amend this and talk about the future. That they exist in the present, hopefully, like this wonderful building we're in, and a lot of objects that they'll continue on for generations and begin to tell new stories as our times change and research becomes even better and better. So keep that in the back of your mind as we go forward. Material culture, objects, artifacts, what does that mean? I mean, there's so many different definitions. Like here's one. Material culture is the study of objects, the artifacts of a society, and the reflection of humanity. But you could identify other meanings for material culture. It's sort of based on your perspective, but I think it really is something that made by humankind or modified. And so material culture studies is looking at these objects and the relationships they have to us, and sort of the meanings that they acquire through time. So anything that is made from particular forms, can be seen as material culture. So when I teach my class, I mean, it's not just high art objects. Frankly, we actually sort of skew away from looking at paintings and things that you would you look at with formal analysis, but anything you could be considered. I usually have a water bottle, when I'm teaching my first class, and I talk about that. What can you tell from a water bottle? Look at all the imprints, the messaging coded in it. You can look at how it's made, that it's, has a seam. You can tell that it's like mass produced, and also, and what is that, by peeling back those layers, then what can you say from a larger perspective? So material culture you've seen throughout this series, different types of objects, from wonderful, sideboards or secretaries' desks, to textiles, samplers, to military objects, to pianos, harpsichords, and so forth. Everything can be considered material culture. But I also think that there's even more than material culture, the power of objects. There's an emotional connection that's imbued within objects. When I teach the course, I give my students a wide variety of perspectives of how people have looked at objects. And we get to sort of theories that look at objects as having power over this relationship with human beings, that they have agency, that it's not just like humans and they make objects and they are, working with objects, but sometimes the objects come back and sort of exude their prominence. So here, and one very, very important thing that I teach all my students is about context. But the context of an object, when it was made, where it is now, how it is presented, is very, very important to always keep in mind. Context is everything in terms of news, current events. What are the contexts that the event is happening, how it's reported, how it's covered. It's all important to how we understand objects and time periods. So here, you see a slide of various objects. You have, I could see on the third row, you have a mixed master. We all have mixed masters in our homes. Hard hat, objects that are utilitarian. But if I add the context that these were published in the New York Times about a year ago as part of a virtual memorial for those we've lost during our time of COVID, they take on much greater resonance. That these are the objects from people left behind. And sorry. And so they have a personal connection to those people, but their family, their friends. And they're not just a glass anymore, but they're someone's glass, their favorite glass. So I think that's also something important to keep in mind as we go forward. But, I let them go. So people have been, you can see why people have been collecting objects, how they're so fascinating. And in terms of this nation, objects have been collected and exhibited and learned societies in the early colonial days, museums like Charles Wilson Peale's Museum in Philadelphia, just at the time of the turn of the century. But as it was noted, I've got a maritime bent in my background, and there's something about sailors. They love to collect. It's sort of in their DNA. So at the turn of into the 19th century, there was another sort of experiment at collecting and exhibiting going up on the North Shore. So I already gave away some of my slide. We're going to use the famous Peabody of the Peabody Essex Museum, Mr. Peabody, to go back in time to August of 1799. And now, like a coastal town that you're in right now, the coastal town of Salem in 1799 was really happening. It was hopping, burgeoning. It was unfeathered trade, and Salem ships were going all over the globe. Sometimes some of the first American ships to even go into certain ports out in Asia or in parts of the Pacific Ocean, which is vast. And here we capture that moment by a young artist, George Ropes, who's an amazing artist, one of the first generation of first generation in this country of maritime artists, taught by a Neapolitan artist who came over the Salem in 1799 named Michel Felice Cornet, and he taught a cadre of local up-and-coming artists. George Ropes was both deaf and mute. And he was able to use his other senses, which were probably highly attuned, to capture moments like this, where he's painting basically the Crown and Shields family, one of two very prominent shipping families on the North Shore at this time, sort of a microcosm of their business and their success. Because you would never have the wharf looking like a car park. Those ships would be at some point across the globe. Maybe you would have one or two back, but it really celebrates the Crown and Shields family. And it's within this context that some mariners who were venturing forth to these new ports decided to form a new marine society called the East India Marine Society. So I'm going to back up quickly for a second. What was a marine society? Well, in the days of colonial America, before the federal government, and this always starts quicker. It's on some timer. I don't know. It's being controlled. Marine societies were created by mariners and sometimes local businessmen to support their kind. Their money would be used to basically, if you were a sailor who died at sea, your widow and children could get relief from the society. They also aided the navigation in the local port. So they would give money to erect lighthouses and buoys. So you find them, and they're very much in that mold. They distinguish themselves as American marine societies because some of the European equivalents have a different sort of founding principle. So as far north as Portland, Maine, the Portsmouth, then to Newburyport, Marblehead. Salem actually had an existing marine society, the Salem Marine Society, founded in 1766, which still exists today, and I'm happy to say that I'm an honorary member. Boston, which was the progenitor of all of them, still active. Providence, Newport, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and then Charleston, South Carolina. And you can see their seals aren't all with us today. So I like the Philly fanatic the best. I think he looks like a mariner. Or he looks like a sea serpent, actually. So you see, there was already, for 33 years, there was an active marine society. Why make another one? Well, those mariners who decided to form the East India Marine Society wanted to form an organization that reflected where Salem was at this point in 1799. And so the East India Marine Society, they wanted one that reflected this sort of global trade. And like every great idea in colonial America, they made this decision and put pen to paper at a tavern, which is located not far, or used to be not far from where the entrance to the museum. For those of you who will be able to make it up, I could point out exactly where it is. And that plaster panel that hung over Benjamin Webb's Sun Tavern still exists in the collection at the Peabody Essex Museum. And they put pen to paper. The amazing thing about the East India Marine Society, they were an active society, they kept minutes, and museum business was high priority. So unlike Charles Wilson Peele's museum and a lot of other cabinets that came and went, the East India Marine Society's records still exist. 1/3 of the collection still exists. It's well documented. So here are their initial bylaws, where the 22 mariners who got together in August of 1799 put pen to paper, so really signifying that this is what they wanted to do. So the captains who formed the society wanted to sort of distinguish themselves further from other marine societies in the country. One main provision is that how you became a member was very, very strict in terms of the qualifications. You needed to be a captain of a Salem ship, or a captain that was from Salem on another ship, or a supercargo, which was the business agent on ship, who navigated near or beyond one of the two capes, Cape Horn or the Cape of Good Hope. So if you never did that as a sailor, you couldn't be a part of the East India Marine Society. The twist is that as Salem sort of waned in its sort of global importance in the 19th century, membership sort of also declined, which is why sort of the East India Marine Society Museum then eventually became the Peabody Academy, and then the Peabody Museum and Peabody Essex Museum. But at that time, it was very sort of an exclusive club. So someone like Joseph Peabody, who was a very influential merchant in Salem in the 1830s, his sailing days were done in the 1790s. He only sailed within sort of Atlantic trade, and he couldn't become a member, even though it was said that President James Monroe, when he came to Salem, waited upon Joseph Peabody rather than the reverse. still. So I show the fellow you see over here is Nathaniel Bowditch, who's sort of the preeminent member because he put American science on the map. He was the first scientist, mathematician, theorist to be taken seriously by European organizations. And he was very influential in helping the society at many points, and then had a second half of his career in Boston, where he was one of the first business actuaries and helped Harvard escape financial ruin in the 1830s. So he has a very distinguished career, and if you were in Mount Auburn Cemetery, you'd see the bust of Nathaniel Bowditch. They were a benevolent organization like the others that I mentioned. So you see, the vagaries of the maritime experience. You can control only so much. You cannot control Mother Nature. You took great risks going across the ocean. So they helped their own kind. And instead of improving local navigation, which they did help support with their brethren society, the Salem Marine Society, the East Indian Marine Society went further. So in true to the name East Indies, they asked all their members, starting in 1801, to take a separate logbook and fill it out and give it back to the society. So the logbook is basically, as you can sort of see in the picture, it's where you record the daily observations at sea from watch to watch also. Wind, weather, the course sailed, maybe some other remarks. Not as exciting as the journals as we think of, where sailors sort of writing down everything that's happening. But for their own interests and sort of as businessmen, before you had a government agency like charting the coast. I mean, these were some ships, from the early ships to go to Japan on a Dutch charter, to islands in the Pacific Ocean. So this was, a corpus of navigational knowledge. And then most importantly, for the founding of the museum, their third founding principle was to form a museum of natural and artificial curiosities, as they say, that were found beyond the Cape of Good Hope and Cape Horn. But when I was doing my research, I found that really that wasn't so true. It was a global enterprise. They were collecting stuff from all over the globe. And it wasn't just them. It was trading partners across the globe. It was other mariners. It was people like today, people coming through the front door, giving an object, accounting for almost half the collection. So it really was kind of a communal endeavor, augmenting what the Marine Society was doing. So below we have a model of the Friendship, a pepper trading ship that if you're in Salem, there's a full replica that the National Park Service constructed in 1998. But this was a model that was actually made by two members of the crew on a voyage in 1805. The model's that big. So they said they made it for the captain's son, but where would you put that in a house from that period? So it was given to the Marine Society, but it was also reminiscent. And for those who visited the museum, this was the vessel that was bringing back lots of goods to Salem, but also all these objects from across the globe. And you can see them here. So if you're trading in those days, you're not always leaving the port with the things that you're eventually going to trade for what you want on certain markets. So in New England, you have coin, you have, cod, you have lumber and so forth, but that's not always what is highly desirable, especially if you're going to China and trading for silks and teas and so forth. So you might go out beyond the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean, trading for different things along the ways to get goods that you want, or you might go around Cape Horn into the northwest coast of North America or into the Pacific Islands for things like sandalwood or furs or bêche de mer, sea cucumbers, really kind of sluggy looking things. They're kind of interesting, especially when dry, they look like cigars, that were highly profitable on the markets where you're gonna go. And the objects that came back were not just the silks and teas, but they were things like the first penguin to be exhibited in a North American museum. Unfortunately stuffed with a very long neck that makes it look like a giraffe, but it still exists. One of my favorite objects in the institution. Or wonderful pieces of art from indigenous peoples in the Pacific Islands. This wonderful temple model from Fiji. But as I said, there was also there were objects that weren't from beyond the Cape. So here is actually a 19th century copy of a Renaissance painting of the death of Abel, that were emblems of American grand tours in the 19th century. So coming, things that you would bring back, like we bring back today to tell your story, or a marker of where you've been. And this was something that was hung prominently in the Marine Society's hall. But one object I find to be the most fascinating, most emblematic or symbolic, and can be read in many ways, and it will come up at different points along as we go, is the first object number 1. It came through the hands of Captain Jonathan Carnes, who commanded the first ship to come back to America with pepper from Sumatra, which yielded, as lore would go, 700% profit. And you think he would have been, he had it made. But I found during my research that actually by the 1820s, he fell on hard times. He was actually asking the Marine Society for help later in his life. It's sort of the vagaries of those who went to sea, those who have farmland. You can till the soil, you can harvest crops, you still have that resource. You're only as good as your next voyage. Or if you then can buy your own ships and start owning ships and get away from the sea. But someone like Carnes was at sea all the time. But he brought back this pipe. Looks sort of like cattle horns, double-ended, a central bowl. It's got tar, patina inside the bowl. Does it denote, was it used to sort of cement a trading relationship? Is it symbolic of coming together of two cultures? We don't know, because while we know it was collected by him in Banda Aceh, Sumatra, no Indonesian arts historian today knows exactly where it was made or if it was even made in Sumatra. So those questions allow you to sort of read into like what they meant, what this object really means. So we'll come back to our friend the pipe. But for those of you who've been to Salem, the East India Marine Society was founded in 1799. By 1825, they had their own permanent building they had constructed called East India Marine Hall. It's the oldest structure at the museum. In those days, if you were visiting Salem, like a lot of people did, and walking down Essex Street, the main thoroughfare, and you came upon the museum, and you would enter where that anchor is today, and you walk down a corridor. You would come down one corridor, hang a left, and you would hit these two sets of stairs, the staircase, and you would walk up these stairs, not knowing what to expect, because as you ascend the flights of stairs, 12, 15 steps, you see nothing but this landing. But it's when you make a 180-degree turn and head up some more sets of stairs that the enormity of this room is palpable. 100 by 45-foot room with 20+ foot high ceilings, filled with light and filled with a lot of objects in those days. One person commented that to walk around this room was to circumnavigate the globe, and that a ticket to the hall allowed that visitor to, quote, enter the chamber of all nations, travel around both capes, and come safely home again in one afternoon. Can't do that on TripAdvisor. What the Marine Society was doing was taking all their objects and making an organized display of the natural, cultural, and spiritual world bound by the sea and open to visual inspection through the efforts of American maritime trade. So if we look south in East India Marine Hall, if you were coming up those staircases, today you see the figureheads. In the 19th century, you would have seen birch bark canoes of indigenous peoples. You would see cases filled with lots of objects, natural history specimens, others. Number 5, one of the last pre-Christian sculptures from Hawaii of the god Ku that once stood on a heiau, or a temple of Kamehameha I, looking out to the sea. So here he would be in front of those windows that actually in those days, today there's another gallery, But in those days, you would actually be able to see the wharf and the ships and the horizon. So you would actually feel surrounded. So Koo was sort of in an environment that would have sort of connected to where the sculpture was before. If you turned around and looking towards Essex Street, we have models of ships from other parts of the globe, Malay pirate ships. In this case, figures of merchants and trading partners in other lands, sometimes made in those countries, sometimes an amalgamation put together by local craftsmen in Salem. So there's a lot in that statement and in that object. 4 and 7 are Neptune's cups, a natural sea sponge that you would find on the bed floor of the waters off of Singapore. So, and then behind this figure in the case was a plaster cast copy of the Laocoon group, the famed classical sculpture that Pliny the Elder said was one of the most magnificent pieces in his time. It was excavated in the 16th century. It was in the Vatican for many years. Napoleon removed it for a while to the Louvre, where possibly that's when this cast was made and then brought back to Italy after. But it was the only object that sort of bridged these worlds, spirituality, but also was above and below the waterline, because the focus of this sculpture is Laocoon, the Trojan priest, and his sons being ensnared by a great sea serpent. They did something that Poseidon did not like. It's funny also, Laocoon is the Trojan priest who warned the Trojans not to take in the Trojan horse. I think we know how that story ended, so I don't need to go into that. On the east and west walls of East India Marine Hall is where you have the majority of the collection. Anything from other large natural history specimens, those huge jaws of a sperm whale that are still in the collection today and on exhibit. Objects from Pacific Island cultures, those Renaissance paintings, those copies of Renaissance paintings. So the number 7, that is the Death of Abel that I showed before. Busts of deities, classical deities, or portraits of people like John Adams, number 14. Portraits of revered members like Nathaniel Bowditch or other local merchants, or revered mariners like Captain Cook, a painting that was done on commission by the East India Marine Society by Michel Felice Cornet, based on an engraving he probably had access to. You also had fireboards, commissions that had scenes of distant ports, and one other that I'll talk about a little bit later. You also had portraits on the same plane of trading partners overseas. So number 11 is one of the silk merchant Esching, China silk merchant. It's on display in our Asian export galleries today, and also religious figures from different parts of East Asia, sort of looking down upon the visitors. But of course, we must sort of recognize that this wasn't a perfect system. This was a Western perspective. There was a little bit of, kind of othering of other cultures. But in its time, it still taught people that would come visit, a lot about the globe. Maybe not through the lens of the Marine Society, through the lens of what little information sometimes they had, or through the lens of people's own sort of backgrounds and what they knew and what they didn't know. But in those days, it was a collection that really sort of opened people in Salem and globally, because it was a museum that was known past the borders, the provincial borders of the state, visitors from all across America and all across the globe. So coming back to our pipe, we could look at this pipe as sort of significant of that endeavor, the sort of two-sided or multi-sided intentions of the Marine Society, and also the realities of American trade at that time, of who was allowed inside the museum, about who was being represented. So keep that in mind. And its story, this pipe has been on display in many ways. So when the East India Marine Society Museum was no more, it was now the Peabody Academy of Science. That pipe and some other objects were known as the relics of the Salem East India Marine Society. One curator John Robinson, who helped form our maritime collection, one of the first in the nation. He was also the keeper of the relics. So you see here in 1892, they're photographing that. For many years, it was then back in East India Marine Hall amongst all the objects that were collected by the East India Marine Society. And today, displayed in our new maritime galleries, which opened in 2019 and take a sort of broader look, this universal significance of the sea across cultures. And here it's part of a little vignette on the East India Marine Society to tell that story and to talk about commercial trade that opened up, that led to the founding of this institution. So that's sort of how, the pipe has changed after the Civil War and how the museum has changed, and how this pipe is now seen. So returning to East India Marine Hall, I want to highlight another couple of objects before connecting to some objects that we actually see here in this room today. And that is of the figure of Kukliakomoko, or Ku, which was, as I mentioned, one of the last carvings of its kind, because when Hawaii converted to Christianity, a lot of these were destroyed. And there's only 3 remaining of these Ku. One is in the Bishop Museum, the other in the British Museum. And Ku has been a central figure in the museum's history, one of the most popular objects in that period and later on. When the East India Marine Society Museum was turned into the Peabody Academy of Science, Frank Leslie's had this wonderful engraving showing what the new museum was going to look like, this sort of American Victorian experience. And you see Ku as a figure in a case as part of this experience. And Ku has sort of spent many years, sort of amongst other Polynesian art as sort of a very central piece of the collection, of that portion of the collection, in various locations near East India Marine Hall. But today, you can see Ku from the street, from Essex Street, as Ku is now co-stewarded with Native Hawaiian practitioners and the Hawaiian delegation. So when Ku is moved to a space, it's very much a very small ceremony before the move and after the move, very much coordinated together. And Ku is on display now in a way that celebrates its history with a label that's translated into Hawaiian, which talk about the importance of Ku in Hawaiian culture. So here's another sort of example of an object that came into the museum in 1846 in terms of Ku and how it was displayed and how it was viewed and how we're today, my colleagues and I are how we're seeing how Ku can be displayed and teach a different story going forward. Another object, which is one that if you are able to make it up to the museum, we'll be able to see, is this fireboard painting, which you see circled here, The Landing of the Pilgrims, commissioned by the East India Marine Society in 1825 when they opened their hall. And here they wanted to, mark this moment of the Pilgrims landing in Plymouth. And with this fireboard, Bartol was a local artist, signing carriage painter, like a lot of these artists who painted other things. But it was very much a scene that sort of mythologized this experience and was kind of it's anachronistic if we look at it today. So you see the sailors, the pilgrims, they're wearing 19th century sailors' outfits. They came upon a land that was inhabited, but at that moment, the people there wasn't anyone greeting them like it is, native indigenous peoples greeting them as they are in the scene. So it's very much sort of like, it's filling a gap in this institutional narrative at the time, but with problems. And now today, it is part of our new gallery that was mentioned before, On This Ground, Being and Belonging in America. It's the first gallery of its kind in this country, I think, because it's taking a look at what we mean by American art. So it's our Native American art collection and our American art collection coming together to tell sort of a much sort of more diverse story. Sorry, my notes here. So the focus of the installation is to explore expressions of what it means to be and belong to community, place, family in the nation. So you hear this is the intro to the gallery, and now the Bartol fireboard is installed in a subsection that you would see when you first get in called Contact and Crisis, talking about how American artists have contemplated and mythologized early interactions. So the fireboard you see on the left is alongside another scene of The Pilgrim's Landing by Karl Nath, who lived in Provincetown, and I painted the painting then. And on the opposite wall, we have portraits by the DNA artist Will Wilson, who uses 19th century photography equipment to capture indigenous peoples today. So using old equipment, but unlike a lot of those photographs in that day, he tells his sitters to dress as they want to be seen. You know, so they come, and so that's a wonderful sort of comparison and a wonderful way of sort of like enriching the story. And one other example of an early object to enter the museum, and I saw the wonderful chair in your galleries when I came in, and I loved how there was a replica of it so people can sit in it and get a sense of it, because this chair is sort of all about that. It's a very early American chair by Thomas Dennis from 1670, a great chair, a sort of a chair made as a sign of importance and of authority in that period. But it's also one of the first objects to enter the other half of our museum's history, the other line, because we trace sort of for the Peabody Essex, but we're in Salem, we're not in Peabody, we're not in Essex, and that confuses some people. I talked about that one line, the East India Marine Society line that became the Peabody because George Peabody endowed the museum in the 1860s, a new museum like he did at Harvard and Yale and in Baltimore and other sort of libraries down south. But the other branch, the Essex side, started as the Essex Historical Society in 1821. And this chair was one of the first objects. So that last summer was the bicentennial of that organization, which in 1848 merged with the Natural History Society to form the Essex Institute, which is the Essex side of the Peabody Essex story, and the two merged in 1992. So last summer, my colleagues who were the curators of the Being and Belonging installation, I had the rare pleasure of being able to work with this object before it went in those galleries. And I wanted to sort of mark the bicentennial, but also tell a sort of new story about this chair. And as, you know, the sort of cleverish line, sometimes a chair is not just a chair. Not only was this one of the first objects, but it was used. It was used by the president at that time, Edward Augustus Holyoake, who was the first president of the Essex Historical Society, and used until the merger as the seat of the head of the Essex Institute. So it's not just, you know, it wasn't just an object, it was a used object. So I love, you know, the replica of the chair here, because what would have felt to sit in the chair like that? You know, you can only do so much with like telling people that, but what's the experience of actually physically being in the chair? And now it's installed in our new galleries, and interpreted, you know, sort of in this larger sense of a subsection called Seeing Ourselves, exploring how objects we keep and pass down disclose complicated layers of meaning surrounding individual and collective identity in America. So you can see amongst other colonial and early American furniture and other objects around. So again, the context of the chair has changed, the interpretation has changed, because in its day, it was seen as a marker of the history of this nation, but it was a history of the Essex, what the Essex Historical Society members thought was the history of the nation, and actually was just limited to the men that were forming the society. And actually, this chair has symbolism beyond that, because if you've read The House of Seven Gables, I know you've all read The House of Seven Gables. This is the chair that was the famous Pynchon chair. This was Hawthorne's model for that. And if you ever read The Scarlet Letter, the whole preface of The Scarlet Letter is Hawthorne's time working in the custom house, looking out as Salem is sort of declining. And he talks about the society. He doesn't have such nice things to say because he sort of sees they're just collecting, these portraits, decaying portraits, as he calls them, as Salem sort of declines at that moment in history. But sometimes you don't have the objects in your collection to tell sort of the other stories. As I said, this chair, so where the other voices that were around when this chair was being made. And sometimes you acquire things. You get new collections, either things that are unearthed that you didn't know about before, or artists working today that are sort of talking about this moment in history. So the chair is actually behind this scene. If you turned yourself around and went down the gallery, you would be on this partition of the gallery. And the figure over here in a section on myths and motives about artists playing a role in creating visual culture to supporting sort of the country as we know it, and depictions of peoples. The artist Hank Willis Thomas has made this sculpture, which is, as you can see from this picture, is very flat, very thin. It's almost jumping off the page because that's exactly what he's doing. He is making a larger than life depiction of sort of 19th century and before stock books that presented small images that were used to print advertisements for runaway slaves. And the coloring is sort of, I think, from the sort of printing technique. When you take that from a newspaper and play with it today, you get this sort of coloring. So this rainbow effect he describes as the aura or spiritual glow of the person, a process of scanning the original book. And that's where you get sort of those highlights. So it's exerting the presence of Black Americans at different parts of the country into the conversation about of colonial America and early America. So here is an instance where I'd say, like, the right stuff, sometimes you continue collecting and new things come about that can tell that narrative. So how does that connect here? Well, I don't even need this slide because I've got the wonderful portraits right here that everyone probably knows the story of, but I'm going to recount just in case. That have been in this collection for many years. Actually, Paula can tell you all about it. She's the one who did all the research on it. So I'm just recounting all the great work that's been done. But popular portrait of two of the couple from Marlborough, Henry and Christian Barnes, that have been popular since they came in the 1920s, but only in the last 10 plus years have their true identity emerged as to their importance and significance. And the scars that are left on the objects themselves, which were done when this couple, according to the history, who were loyalists, went back to England, but the scarring may have come from that, the attack on the paintings. But I think we can, and I like how they're still preserved. They were obviously repaired and stabilized here, but they're preserved because I think that marker, like is a material way of getting into the larger significance of these portraits because of who painted them. Prince Dema, who the only enslaved artist working in colonial America whose paintings have survived. These are two of only three in the nation, the other at the Metropolitan Museum. An enslaved artist working for the Barneses, and when they escaped, when they fled back to England, he remained in Boston. He identified himself as Prince Dema Limner and basically freed himself. Enlisted in the Massachusetts militia to fight for the nation, the emerging nation, but unfortunately died a year later from disease. Portraiture during this time period, like, sort of confers authority. But where does that authority come from? How are some businessmen making, their wealth? And it's not always direct. They're not always directly involved in the slave trade, but everyone's sort of connected. In our maritime galleries, we discuss this with some paintings because it's just the nature of networks. And you might not be in that network, but if you're sending waste fish, what they call refuse fish, poor ports of a cod, the heads down to the Caribbean to feed enslaved Africans, you are part of the system and sort of like a step removed. So the materiality of these paintings and those scars are a way of getting at who painted them, and the scars, sort of that we're at this moment connecting to. And on the other side, early objects within this collection, these wonderful banners, and there's great reproductions of them over there that you could look at after. When I was, generously, Deirdre was able to let me get a sort of portal into sort of the collection, get a sense of different objects. And I looked at the date and I said, these are, within a year of the founding of the Hingham Historical Society. So some of the earliest ones. And the statements that were being made for these abolitionist banners, donated by Susan B. Willard, also same as the portraits, are as powerful then as they are today. So some of the earliest objects connected with this institution are just as relevant. And like the Hank Willis Thomas sculpture I mentioned, you collect for the moment. What's the right stuff? Well, the objects that sort of speak about this time period. One we'll never forget, that will be with us forever, of not just the pandemic, but social justice movements and people sort of having a voice and coming together and expressing that voice, and hopefully, making change. And hopefully, as we continue to go down into the future as a nation, one where we'll all be together listening to each other and to promote greater change. But these photographs by Brooke Barletta, local photographer, I think are very powerful. These are just a few of them. I like the dinosaur. Reminds me of inflatable dinosaur I had as a kid. So, but they're powerful statements. So returning to the pipe, it's a symbol of many things. The things I talked about, the East Indian Marine Society, or even the symbol of things you could look at any object, that there's multiple perspectives. That an object represents the past, the present, and the future. And things to keep in mind as we work with objects and tell a greater story of the nation's history. So with that, I thank you.
So George, don't go away because we expect to ask you questions.
I hope there's updates on the Celtic game in the chat.
No, some of us have recorded it, so it'll be fresh.
Yeah, that's all right. It doesn't matter until the last 5 minutes. You've got 2 more hours before that you can worry.
So I'm going to open it for questions now, and we'll more fully thank you, George, at the end of the Q&A. We have a wonderful audience here, and we also have an audience on Zoom. So I will bring this microphone around for those of you who'd like to ask a question. And I ask you to speak into the microphone like this when you ask a question, and George will stay here to answer them. So who would like to offer a thought, a question, a comment, reflecting on what George has illuminated, and especially his talk about what the kinds of things that formed his museum and their collection, but also reflecting back on the series that we just concluded and all the different types of collections that you've seen. Any thoughts, comments, questions? I may have to go to the Zoom audience for the first brave person. I have a question here.
Me? Well, about that pipe, is this on? Yeah. Okay. The first thing that comes to mind, of course, and you mentioned a couple of things that it might represent, is a peace pipe. And of course, it's before the peace pipes we think of in this country, supposedly. But was there any evidence that this was something that was part of either a treaty or an agreement? Or do we have any thoughts?
It looks like it's just the carvings, the decorations, they speak to different places in the region, but no real context for it. It was used at some point. I'm not going to give that away because that's sort of the ending of my book. So a little bit about that, but there is patina. So it was smoked at some point in its history. But I think, when you have, an object where you don't have all the information, that's when, to get back to the fellow I brought in earlier, Jules Brown, when he teaches material culture, or what he did teach material culture when he was teaching at Yale University, his methodology had all his students start with close looking at an object, even if you know this is a glass, trying to take your knowledge away and just trying to describe, and not just describe, as I tell my students, with your eyes. Pick up the glass, feel it, tap it, use multiple senses and take down those notes, and then start to do research, and then come back to the object a lot. So here's one word, and it's whether you agree with sort of this idea as he puts forth, I didn't put it on the slide, that sometimes you get more of an object from the past, reading it as fiction than fact, sort of conjecture. But the flip side is sometimes you find out a little bit more about the practitioner than the object itself. But I think the lesson is sort of when you presented like with the pipe or something that you just don't have the context, try to take a step back and look at it. Because with a lot of objects, these portraits, objects that have been in collections for years, that we know so much about, we've been around so much, but sometimes we just have the visual memory we're going on. We're not always like looking at it. Sometimes when you take a fresh look, and I like to, connect to another story by a educator at the Natural History Museum in Halifax in the 80s, who wrote this article that I use in my class called 50 Ways to Read a Big Mac Box. He talks about how he used to take living specimens like reptiles, in this case, turtles, around to different classes and use them to teach, talk about them, let the kids observe them. And he noticed one time there was this kid, and these were snapping turtles. There's this one kid who kept flipping on its back, and he saw this was going on, and he was about to go over and basically scold the kid. He thought the kid was just, being a nuisance and being, cruel to this animal. But what the kid observed, immediately he told him, he said, every time I flip it on its back, it uses its head to sort of push right itself. And this is sort of an adaptive, characteristic of the turtle. And this educator at the museum then contacted a well-known herpetologist or someone he knew, and that herpetologist didn't even really know that about that species of snapping turtle. So it's another point of that sometimes someone points out something that you haven't observed before, and it might change the meaning of the object or the way you view it.
Halifax is a wonderful museum.
It is. I can attest, my father and my mother and my brother and I went there many times. It's a wonderful place. And they actually do have, speaking of the turtles, they still have a living a gopher tortoise that's about 90 years old or something like that. So.
And a question here?
Hi, we've been to the museum, and I was just wondering how many of the pieces from the original, you showed us how it was originally set up. How many of those are still in that newly renovated room? And I know you showed pieces that are displayed elsewhere.
Yeah. So, right now, East Indian Marine Hall is sort of in a transition where, because we did new construction that opened in 2019 that was right next to East Indian Marine Hall. So there was a worry about the vibrations. And so we're thinking about, what this room, this is a great moment, what this room will look like going forward. It's like myself and colleagues are working on that. But about a third of the collection from that period of the East Indian Marine Society. So from 1799 to 1867, when they then became the Peabody Academy of Science, third of the collection still exists. A lot of that sort of like, loss was natural history specimens. A lot of them decayed, and especially in the summertime in a hall, then they, at that point, they weren't always the most adept, in terms of like keeping specimens preserved. Sometimes you would just refill the jar with some alcohol. And so things, went by the wayside, but the third still is, a really big number. So the objects I shared, today are all on display. So you'll see them in various places in the museum.
We have
Thanks.
a really interesting observation and question from one of our Zoom audience members. Thank you, Stephanie, for this great question. I'm going to read the whole thing. It is so important to realize that we are part of history. Thanks to the Society for emphasizing that. I've always loved my visits to PEM and felt grateful for the resources that museum has that make it possible. So often we take the objects of our time for granted, like the mix master that you showed. How would you advise parents of youngsters to make their children aware of the importance of such objects?
As a parent, I can already tell you that's a tough task. I mean, I was taught, my father's here today, but I was given, I appreciated the things around me, and I'm where I am right now because of that. My girls, not, they appreciate the sort of the temporal objects that we are part of where we are today. But I think just, like anything, not forcing but exposing children to different types of objects and histories. And obviously, where the education system and institutions like Hingham and other cultural institutions can come together using objects to teach history is a great way of opening people's eyes. The Mixmaster, I pointed that one out because I actually had a student 2 semesters ago who wrote her paper. I basically do a main project that I didn't create out of a vacuum, that it's sort of Jules Brown and others have done. I let my students pick any object they want and then explore it during the semester. So the Mixmaster was one that one student sort of explored and had great things to say about, connections to family or context of how this was made, what the Mixmaster, how it was advertised, and what, who it was marketed towards, and what kind of ideal sort of it was talking about and how it's used today. So, and I have a lot of students who have objects that they that have become heirlooms or a part of their family in some ways, but they were made for another context. So that sort of context thing is very important for, viewing objects and thinking about objects.
The one thing I'd add, just based on how Stephanie framed her comment, that we are a part of history, is having children do oral histories with members of their family and learn things about the history that they're living through or that their parents lived through. And I've recently come across an audio cassette that my son did as a school exercise, where he interviewed his parents about things that were going on in New York City at the time. And to me, that's such a valuable time capsule, both of how this little boy saw things and how his parents at the time in the moment saw things. And so I think that's a very useful way to get children engaged in understanding that, people have a lot of interesting history as well.
Yeah. And personal family histories are a great way to sort of a portal to go through. Because if it's someone that you're related to, you're going to be much more interested. And it's important to do those oral histories because, some of the generations and those stories are starting to go away. So you think about the projects with Holocaust survivors the numbers are dwindling, and there's been projects in the last years of people sort of interviewing and basically learning the stories of these survivors. And then when those survivors are gone, they tell the stories. And a lot of that is tied to the sort of the Holocaust Museum, but there's other sort of examples you can pick here and there. You want to be able to capture those so we can learn lessons in the future.
Ellen Miller has a question.
So my question is about curating collections, and I was going to ask it before you told the turtle story, but it fits in very nicely. So you have an object, and there's some sort of continuum between just having the object there that people can look at and hopefully engage with and come up with their own thoughts about it, versus maybe you having some signs that direct them as to why you chose to place that object there, versus perhaps having a docent stand and tell the story, which we do of the portraits, and provide a complete context, and often don't have time for a reaction from the audience. Talk a little bit, if you would, about that. I see you nodding. So
Well, it's the challenges we still face with curating. I mean, we have a lot of tools now. We have a lot of interactive and media tools and technology. And sometimes they could be glitzy, but they're not always the best ways of getting those stories. And sometimes they can do things that sort of make their capability is important, or you can manipulate something that you might not be able to touch, and have a model that you can sort of like engage with. But it's, a lot of it goes down to the choices that you make. I mean, you ideally, hopefully, would start any sort of labeling with close looking. That's sort of the bent I come from, where you start with what someone can see immediately and engage them, and then bring in all the context. But again, you're also dealing with, and like us all, even some of us will admit that we read every label and stuff, every object. That's the utopian view. It's not always the case. So what can you grab? So how can you use language, or how can you use certain types of text to draw people? But then, that's where the wonderful role of docents and guides and those who engage with visitors every day can have a much richer story. So I think it's always sort of a balance, and it comes down to, your institution and funding and what you can do, what kind of labeling, what kind of media and so forth you can do. But one example I didn't bring in today because there's a lot to talk about, but an object that would be something you would walk by, because it's a stick. It looks like a stick. What it actually is a calendar stick of a guy who was wrecked on one of the most remote places on earth, Tristan da Cunha, little island. Here's South America, here's Africa, here's this island with nothing but water. And he was there for 160 something days. And sort of in the mold of like Robinson Crusoe, who talks about a cross he made and not making notches to mark the days. This fellow who carved his name in, we know who he is, we know where he was from, when he was born, and all these notches, but a lot of his story is missing. But when it's put in a case, like I showed you that, Easton Marine, all those wall cases with other objects, how does it come forward? So today we actually have, in our new Maritime Gallery, have made 3 moments where we have sort of a little enclosed circle we call a pod that tells this story with visuals and narration, and has you sit and engage with the object. So that's a way you can do it, because ordinarily, it's a stick, maybe there's some carving on it, but probably walk by because it just doesn't scream out at you. And we can all think about objects in the collection that can do stuff like that. So again, it's, if you have the abilities to do something like that, or how can you arrest someone's attention if there's an object that demands a richer story? So,
Other questions here?
hope that answered something.
Thank you. Going back to the engaging children, I have 2 sons, one of whom is fascinated by everything in the past, everything to do with our family. Brothers and sisters, not necessarily at all. One, nothing to do with it. But he has engaged us, and my husband first last year and me this year, with something called Storyworth. And every week, one of us gets a question about something with our family. And we've gone through, our relatives, our grandparents, our parents, our immigration story, our marriages. And it's been fascinating, and it's the way he does, and it's published at the end of the year as a book for the rest of the family.
That's fantastic.
The other question I wanted to ask is, when did the museum become more modern? I remember going to the museum probably in the 50s, and it was in the one room pretty much, and then it expanded in the Forbes Museum from Milton.
Yep.
When was that?
When was the Forbes?
Well, the whole
So Easton Marine Hall was really the only gallery until 1889, and then another. Yeah, it's okay. Neither do I. That's when the first sort of like galleries where expansion was made on the property, off of Easton Marine Hall. The Forbes Museum came in the 70s, and then the museum, that part of the museum, the Peabody side expanded. The biggest expansion came until today came in the 70s, when what's called the Dodge Wing now was built, sort of brutalist architecture that sort of expanded the gallery footprint. And then we had the work by Moshe Safdie in 2003, and that's when it really became big. The Essex Institute was across the way in the buildings that are still there today with their collections. And there was always stuff going back and forth the different years, but then finally merged together. So then you had, the museum is a much larger space because it's not just the footprint of the two buildings, but it's all these historic homes that the museum owns and properties at different parts of Salem. So it's a much bigger campus. But to get back to your, the two sort of kids that are opposite in their interest, it's also time. The time will change. When I was first taken to Salem, when I was 7 years old, my father took my mother and my brother and I up. I wasn't a museum kid, and I think they had to drag me inside. So, but I came to have an appreciation. So sometimes it doesn't happen in childhood, but again, being exposed to it, and you come back to different points in your life, and sometimes it clicks.
More questions from the audience?
Hi.
Hi.
I just wanted sort of a comment, but one of the things that I find the most fascinating about objects is that they were not always used, the way that they were intended to be used. Like I was thinking about your drinking glass might have been used to dispense medicine or to hold crayons.
Yeah.
I have an archaeology background as well,
Yeah.
so
Nice.
we see a lot of that in archaeology, looking at things like wear patterns, as far as identifying
Exactly.
purpose and
Yeah.
use. So, not really a question, but just something that I like to think about looking at objects.
Yeah, and that's where, kind of your training, as you have training in certain things, you can read different things that some people might not observe at first glance. But then you get a connection to who made that object, and sort of the materiality then can speak. So I always stress to my students to have your larger concepts always come from the object. What it is about your object that speaks to what the larger things you want to say.
I was just thinking that the things that survive the best are most likely the things that are kind of used the least, whereas things that are used more often would break eventually and wear down. So how do historians sort of deal with that, where the things that survive might actually not have been the most useful or the most used things, whereas things that were used every day sort of, and things, not necessarily owned by wealthy people, but
Yeah.
poor people just use things until they destroyed. How do you
Yeah.
deal with that?
Well, that's where sort of a kind of multidisciplinary approach to looking at objects and looking at the past really helps, because going back to the comment about archaeology, historical archaeology, the nature of the practice is sort of to merge the written record with the archaeological record. So the archaeologists, sort of one of the preeminent American historical archaeologists, one of the first ones or to sort of be in that mold, James Dietz, who did a lot of work around Massachusetts, looked at what he called small things forgotten. And that was the title of his book. And he looked at the pipe stems that you would get from excavating, the gravestones that you see all around New England. And sometimes in the archaeological record, in that case, gets at the people who might not be reflected in the written record, or as you said, the objects are used a lot and they're not maintained. But it's also, your background. If you're looking at, decorative arts, if you're a specialist in that, you're looking at a lot of stuff. So you can understand the difference between something that might have been made and really preserved and not used to those that you can tell that are repaired, or that you're able to identify an object that just was unusual because all sorts of things about this particular type of object class. So it's sort of having a very open mind, and also working with other people, other specialists. So, a lot of the objects I talk about, we tell richer stories because it's not just our voice or the curatorial voice, the institution's voice. Sometimes it's the voice of the artist who we're working with, like that photographer, Will Wilson, I talked about, or sometimes people within certain communities that we're representing through objects that, in the case of the gallery that my colleagues worked on, the Being and Belonging on this ground, they actually have 30 different authors for different objects from different communities. So then you have a larger perspective to go on.
More questions from the audience?
Thanks so much, George. I had a question about, when you showed that map, did the East India Marine were working on an exhibition about archaeology and learning the concept of repatriation when you have to give pieces back. And so, for instance, like Ku, did the Hawaiian nation ever ask for it back? Or has the East India Marine Society, I mean, I know that's a whole nother lecture, but I'm just wondering how.
Well, Ku is a little bit more complicated because Ku was something that was one of few things that wasn't destroyed when practices changed. But the remaining Kus actually all came together at the Bishop Museum maybe 8 years ago on a display. So they sort of came back. But in terms of repatriation, the museum has always been connected to the legislation, NAGPRA. Our now one of our former directors was actually part of a lot of the codification of NAGPRA. So we work actively with indigenous nations when there are claims on certain objects that are in the collection. The East Indian Marine Society, a lot of their collection, it runs the gamut of like some of those types of Native American objects, but also things that were made for tourists, things that were made specifically like for sailors that were in parts, like very savvy Native artists in places like the Northwest Coast that were making like types of pipes out of argillite, but in the shape of a ship. We have one of those for sale because here's this new sort of, tourist coming or someone coming by that, they can like make an object for them. Or, there's a lot of objects that were given by the people that own the object. So it's a big, sort of mix of that type of stuff. But yeah, with NAGPRA, we've always been, one that actively, was championing, NAGPRA like a lot of other institutions and being part of the process, which is great.
I think it was mentioned in the introduction that you also have a great interest in maritime art.
Yeah.
Is that right? I think I remember a time going to Penn when you had a big Turner exhibit. Wasn't that it?
Yeah, I didn't. I was back in doing my doctorate at that point. And my colleague, who's the head maritime curator, I've worked with him a lot. Yeah.
I'm seeing there are Turner exhibits all around, but that was terrific. I was just wondering if you could say something about it. Have you done any more of those, or is that something that PEM is going to do? Not necessarily Turner, but other.
No. Well, last summer we had a show that sort of really took a new look at what we think of as art of the sea in American waters. That was put together by my colleague, the head maritime curator, who was at PEM, is now at Crystal Bridges, and myself and another colleague of mine, which explored that it sort of like tried to break down these artificial boundaries of maritime art to show that the sea was vital. It was a vital influence of artists across the board from early days till the present. So that was sort of a big maritime show that we had. And there'll be other ones down the pipeline, but the Turner show was one that was organized by the National Maritime Museum. But a few years after that, I worked with my colleague on our big ocean liner exhibit that we partnered with the Victoria and Albert. So yeah, we're always sort of, the maritime is very important. Yeah.
Any more questions in the room today? All right. Well, I want to thank George profusely.
Thank you.
Didn't want feedback, so I turned off the other microphone. So George has not only enlightened us in a new way about the meaning of objects and context, but also drawn this series to a conclusion. And I want to thank our audience for their engagement throughout the series. We've had such an array of topics, but all rooted in things that the Historical Society has in its collections. And it's just been a fascinating exploration, but it was enlivened by the interest of you as an audience. So thank you, both those of you on Zoom and those of you in the room today. You make this all possible. Another thank you to everyone involved in the Society, both staff and volunteers, who make it possible for these collections to live on. because both documenting what they are, scanning information, housing these collections in a certain way, making sure we know what's in each box. This all takes a lot of effort. Much of this is volunteer effort, but also staff. And, this series obviously wouldn't be possible without all of that work. And so thank you to all of those of you who are present, who are part of that. And those of you who are out there in Zoom land, thank you. Really wonderful. And as we end the formal part of our program, I wanted to do two things. One is let everyone in the room know that there's a wonderful reception set up on the first floor, and George is joining us there, and he will sign copies of his book if you would like to purchase one to take home with you today. So that's a fun way to end your day at the Society today. But I also wanted to give you a hint of what is in store next year, because the Education Committee that I'm really proud to be part of thought long and hard about what is next. And we are going to bring together leading academics from all over the country to bring 21st century perspectives to a topic that is very important as this country approaches its 250th anniversary, because when the English colonists came here, there was a population of people who used the land, lived on the land, and appreciated the land, and yet the Europeans had different ideas. And so what we're going to focus on is how the arrival of English settlers in this part of North America impacted the lives and land of Native peoples. And I'm really delighted to say we have a wonderful faculty, really, of academics from around the country, some of whom will be here live in Hingham, some of them who will be zooming in to us. They each have distinct topics to talk about, and I'm going to leave it there because later this summer you'll be hearing more about who they are and what their topics are, but we're very much looking forward to that as our next lecture series. So with that, let me invite you all to, thank you to the Zoom audience. We're going to end the Zoom now, and everyone here, if you want to go to the first floor, we have a wonderful reception and George's books, which he's willing to sign. Thank you.
Thank you.